Welcome to Module 24 on Strand-based routing. This presentation takes a technical deep dive into how BMPFast uses a directed graph routing engine to model the movement of pollutant loads and runoff volumes through a network of catchments. We'll walk through all three stages of the process: strand identification, routing method determination, and calculation with aggregation. By the end, you'll have a solid understanding of how each software class contributes to the system and how overall efficiency is computed. Strand-based routing is the core hydraulic and water quality engine inside BMPFast. The network itself is represented as a directed graph, where each catchment node points to the next downstream catchment through what's called the to-ID property. This structure allows the software to trace flow paths from any starting point all the way down to an outlet. A strand is simply an ordered sequence of catchments beginning at a headwater node and ending at an outlet. Think of it as a single continuous flow path threading through the network. Every routing analysis follows three sequential stages. First, the software identifies the strands within the network. Second, it determines the appropriate routing method for each strand. And third, it performs the calculations and aggregates the results. These responsibilities are divided cleanly among dedicated software classes, with each class handling its own distinct part of the process. This separation keeps the engine organized and makes it easier to understand how data flows from one stage to the next. The routing graph is a directed graph where the to-ID property on each catchment defines its downstream neighbor. This structure ensures that calculations always proceed in the correct flow direction, moving from upstream catchments down through the network to the outlet. Several classes work together to make this system function. Project routing is responsible for identifying strands and dispatching calculations in the right order. Strand calculations contains the specialized procedures for each calculation method, handling the actual logic of how flow and nutrients are computed at each step. Individual BMP classes then expose the hydraulic and nutrient properties needed at each node in the graph. Keeping these responsibilities clearly separated is a deliberate design choice. It makes the codebase easier to maintain, and it means that when you need to trace through the logic, each piece of the system has a well-defined role. You know where to look when something needs to be updated or debugged, and changes in one area are less likely to create unintended consequences in another. Stage 1 begins with a function called getAllRoutingChains, which starts at every leaf node in the catchment network. Leaf nodes are catchments that have no upstream contributors. They are the starting points of the drainage system. From each of these leaf nodes, the function follows the downstream linkages all the way to the outlet, and each of those traversal paths gets recorded as a strand. A strand, in this context, is simply a chain of catchments connected in series from upstream to downstream. The interesting challenge arises when the network converges. That is, when two or more separate routing chains arrive at the same downstream catchment. If we process these naively, we would end up counting that shared downstream segment multiple times, which would corrupt the load calculations. To handle this correctly, the shared downstream segment is split off into its own distinct strand. The upstream substrands that feed into it are processed first, and once those calculations are complete, their outlet results, specifically the combined volume, the combined total nitrogen load, and the combined total phosphorus load, are injected into the downstream strand as inputs. This dependency ordering is critical. By ensuring the upstream substrands finish before the shared segment begins, the model maintains accuracy without ever recomputing the same catchment twice. It is a clean and efficient way to respect the branching structure of a real-world drainage network. Before any calculations begin, BMPFast inspects every node along a strand to determine which types of best management practices are present. Based on that inspection, the strand is assigned one of 7 possible routing methods. Those 7 methods include retention in series, detention in series, no treatment to detention, no treatment to retention, independent catchments, and 2 additional methods that handle edge cases. Getting this classification right is absolutely critical, because each method triggers a fundamentally different calculation procedure downstream. The independent catchments method is particularly important to understand. It handles mixed BMP configurations where different types of practices are combined along a strand. And it also serves as the fallback method when none of the other specialized classifications apply. Regardless of which routing method is used, Every node in every strand follows the same fundamental mass balance framework. For hydraulics, the total volume entering a BMP equals the runoff generated by that node's own catchment drainage area, plus any volume passed down from the upstream node. For nutrients, the total load entering the BMP works the same way. It's the sum of the locally generated load and the discharged load from whatever node sits upstream. Once the total entering load is established, the fraction removed is determined by the provided removal efficiency value assigned to that node. How that efficiency value gets supplied is where the routing methods diverge. In series-based methods, the efficiency is computed from cumulative system-level calculations that account for the connected sequence of BMPs. In simpler standalone methods, it's just the BMP's individual efficiency applied directly. Either way, the mass balance logic at the node level is identical. The same framework applies throughout. Whatever load is not removed exits the node as discharged load and flows to the next downstream node in the strand. When every node in a strand is classified as a retention best management practice, the retention in series method is triggered. As the calculation moves forward from node to node, it accumulates two running totals: the total retention volume across all the basins encountered so far, and the total contributing drainage area associated with those basins. Once those cumulative values are established, dividing the total retention volume by the total contributing area gives you what's called a system treatment depth. This depth represents, on average, how deeply the combined set of basins is treating the runoff flowing through the system, essentially a blended measure of the collective storage capacity relative to the land draining into it. That system treatment depth is then used to look up removal efficiencies for total nitrogen and total phosphorus from a retention efficiency table. Rather than looking up efficiencies for each individual basin separately, the method treats all the basins together as one unified system, and the resulting efficiencies reflect that combined performance. Those looked-up efficiencies are then applied to the post-development pollutant load entering each node in the strand. The key advantage here is that chaining retention basins together in series produces a higher combined removal efficiency than any single basin would achieve on its own, capturing the real-world benefit of treating runoff through multiple retention stages in sequence. The routing diagram displays the results for each strand within the project, giving you a visual representation of how water flows through the network. The detention in series method applies when every node in the network is a wet detention best management practice. The central parameter in this approach is the average residence time, or ART, which measures how long water lingers within a basin. The longer water remains in a basin, the more opportunity there is for settling and biological uptake to remove pollutants. For each catchment contributing runoff to the system, the software determines how much of each downstream basin's ART is attributable to that particular catchment's flow. It does this by weighting the basin's ART according to the catchment's share of cumulative runoff passing through that basin. These weighted contributions are then summed across all downstream basins to produce a total ART value for that catchment. Once the total ART is established, log linear regression equations translate that value into removal efficiencies for total nitrogen and total phosphorus. Those efficiency values feed directly into the per-node mass balance calculations, allowing the model to determine how much of each pollutant is removed as water moves through the series of detention basins. This approach captures the compounding treatment benefit that occurs when water passes through multiple wet detention structures in sequence. These two methods address a very common real-world configuration where several upstream catchments receive no best management practice treatment, and a single downstream BMP is sized to handle the combined flow from all of them. Untreated nodes behave as pure pass-through points. Their entire runoff volume and nutrient load move downstream without any capture or removal occurring at those locations. Before the downstream BMP can be calculated, the software first aggregates everything from the upstream nodes: total drainage area, total runoff volume, and total nitrogen and phosphorus mass loads. That combined picture becomes the input to the downstream BMP. For the no treatment to detention pathway, the downstream BMP is configured using this combined runoff volume and total area, and the calculate method derives an average residence time-based efficiency for the aggregated system. For the no treatment to retention pathway, the process goes a step further. Because retention efficiency depends on watershed hydrology rather than just volume alone, the configuration also incorporates area-weighted watershed parameters. Things like the impervious fraction of the drainage area and the rainfall depth. These hydrologic characteristics influence how much water a retention practice can actually capture and treat, so they need to be properly weighted across all contributing upstream areas before the downstream BMP efficiency can be determined accurately. Once all strands have been identified and classified, the system moves into calculation dispatch. The project trouting dispatch strand calculation function reads each strand's method classification and routes it to the appropriate procedure within strand calculations. Think of the dispatch function as a routing table. It maps method enumerations directly to specific function calls, ensuring each strand is processed by the correct calculation logic. Processing order here is not arbitrary. Strands that fade into a convergence point must finish calculating before the downstream shared strand can be processed. That dependency ordering was established back in Stage 1, and Stage 3 enforces it during dispatch. This sequencing is what keeps the hydraulic relationships between strands mathematically consistent. As each calculation procedure runs, it writes its results back to the strand's node records. Those per node outputs include volume retained, load removed, and load discharged, the core values that carry through to the final system-level results. When working with network structures, upstream nodes don't operate in isolation. They are aggregated together, and their data or flow is routed into the downstream strands. This aggregation process is what connects the broader network, pulling information from multiple upstream sources and channeling it forward through the system. Once all strand calculations are complete, the model moves into an aggregation phase to assemble project-level results. Outlet loads are derived exclusively from terminal strands, meaning those strands whose most downstream catchment routes directly to the project outlet. This is an important distinction. If non-terminal strands were included in the outlet load total, loads that pass through convergence junctions would be counted more than once. By restricting outlet loads to terminal strands only, the model avoids that double counting problem. For total catchment loads across the project, the model sums the per catchment post-development load values from every strand, and for total removed loads, it accumulates removal values using the method-specific removal properties that were written out during the calculation phase. This matters because different strands may use different calculation methods, and the removal accounting needs to stay consistent with whichever method was applied to each individual strand. Keeping these two totals, loads and removals, tied to their respective calculation methods ensures the final project summary accurately reflects how the system was actually modeled. System efficiency is the headline metric that summarizes a project's overall water quality performance. It is calculated by taking the total removed pollutant load and dividing it by the total catchment load, then expressing that result as a percentage. This calculation is performed independently for both total nitrogen and total phosphorus, giving engineers a separate efficiency figure for each pollutant. One important detail in the calculation is that the result is clamped between 0 and 100%. This safeguard exists because floating point arithmetic and edge cases can occasionally produce values that fall outside a physically meaningful range. By enforcing those bounds, the system ensures the reported efficiency always makes sense in the real world. This single percentage value is remarkably useful. It allows engineers to compare alternative best management practice configurations side by side, assess whether a project meets regulatory compliance thresholds, and communicate overall performance to stakeholders in a format that is clear and immediately understandable. Rather than presenting raw load numbers that require context to interpret, system efficiency distills the project's performance down to one straightforward figure. To bring everything together, the full routing pipeline works in 3 distinct stages, each building on the last to produce a final system efficiency result. Stage 1 traverses the directed graph using the getAllRoutingChains function, detects where flow paths converge, and splits any shared segments into separate strands. Upstream load injection is handled here, ensuring that each strand enters the next stage with the correct incoming load values. Stage 2 is entirely about classification. Before any computation begins, the system inspects the BMP types at every node in every strand and assigns one of 7 routing methods. Those methods include retention in series, detention in series, 2 distinct no-treatment variants, independent catchments, and a pair of edge case handlers. Getting this classification right is critical, because it determines which calculation logic gets applied in the next stage. Stage 3 dispatches each strand to its specialized calculation procedure, processing them in dependency order so that upstream results are always available before downstream strands are evaluated. Once all strands have been processed, outlet loads are aggregated from terminal strands only, and total catchment loads and removed loads are summed for both total nitrogen and total phosphorus. Underlying all of this is the per-node hydraulic and nutrient mass balance framework. Every routing method, regardless of its complexity, builds on that consistent foundation. And the final deliverable from the entire pipeline is system efficiency, a single, clear measure that gives engineers a meaningful way to evaluate how well a BMP system is performing across the catchment as a whole.